Have you ever noticed how some people seem to live better financially than everyone else, even though they never really talk about money? Frequent trips, expensive restaurants, always new clothes, a life that looks sorted out, stable, almost enviable. The uncomfortable question is, what if that image isn't the result of money, but the constant effort to hide the lack of it? That feels normal, but it isn't. We've been conditioned to believe that people who look good on social media are doing well. In real life, that an appearance of success is a natural consequence of financial success, and almost no one questions that because questioning it takes work, emotional work, mental work. It takes admitting that what sparks admiration, comparison, even envy might actually be a carefully constructed display designed not to collapse. There's a very specific character almost no one sees clearly, the influencer who looks wealthy but lives counting down the days to the next post, not because they love creating, but because they need to keep the story alive. They need to sustain the image. They need to feed the algorithm, the engagement, the outside perception. In this case, income doesn't come from accumulated wealth, but from the ability to always appear in motion, always winning, always ahead. And this is where the game starts to change. Because when appearance becomes the main currency, it stops being aesthetic and turns into survival. The next post isn't just content, it's oxygen. The next story isn't spontaneous, it's upkeep. And almost no one notices this point because everything is designed to feel light, natural, effortless. But behind the camera, there's a quiet pressure that never makes it to the feed. Maybe you've experienced this in another way. Maybe not as an influencer, but as a viewer, comparing your life to someone you follow, feeling like you're falling behind, questioning your financial choices because they don't perform well visually. Does that sound familiar? Because social comparison doesn't start when you want to compete. It starts when you believe what you're seeing represents the full reality. And what's most interesting is that, deep down, most people know social media is just a highlight reel. Still, they react as if it were the whole truth. They spend more than they can. They buy things to avoid looking out of the game. They adjust financial decisions, not to what makes sense, but to what avoids social discomfort. This isn't just about consumption. This is behavioral financial psychology playing out quietly, every single day. The influencer who lives off appearances isn't some isolated exception. They're an amplified symptom of something that happens on a smaller scale to a lot of everyday people. The difference is that for them, comparison isn't occasional, it's structural. And when an image has to be maintained at any cost, money stops being a tool and becomes an anesthetic. If this makes you feel a bit uneasy, stay with me. Because understanding this invisible character isn't about judging them. It's about seeing how social comparison shapes financial decisions that feel personal, but rarely are. And this is exactly where the conversation starts to go deeper. And maybe the most delicate part of all this is realizing that no one enters this game thinking they're losing themselves. Quite the opposite. Most people believe they're just keeping up, adapting, doing what everyone else is doing. It feels harmless. It feels normal, but it isn't. Because when your reference point becomes what shows up on a screen, the standard stops being what actually makes sense for your life and becomes whatever helps you avoid discomfort, comparison, or silence. And that's the moment financial decisions start being made more to support an image than to build real security. If, as you're listening to this, a specific situation came to mind, an expense that now makes more sense than it did before, or that uneasy feeling of always chasing something that never quite arrives, it's worth putting that into words. Sometimes, writing in the comments what hit you the hardest here isn't just engagement. It's a way of organizing your own thoughts and realizing this experience isn't isolated. When someone else reads it and recognizes themselves, a quiet space of identification is created, something that rarely exists outside of here. And if this conversation is making you look at money differently, in a more honest, more conscious way, liking the video becomes a simple way of saying that this kind of reflection matters. Not to inflate numbers, but to keep this type of content circulating, reaching people who might be going through the exact same conflict and still don't have the words for it. Subscribing to the channel follows the same logic, not as an obligation and not as an empty promise, but as a signal that you want to keep exploring these themes more deeply, without rush, without a ready-made formula. Because the story of the influencer who lives off appearances is only the surface of something much bigger. And as we go further, it becomes clearer and clearer that the issue isn't just with who shows up on the screen, but with how all of us were taught to confuse value, money, and recognition. And that's exactly where the next part begins to reveal things almost no one takes the time to look at. Now, I want to go even deeper into this, because there's a detail almost no one notices. When looking at this kind of life, appearance isn't a side effect of money. It becomes a fixed expense, not occasional, fixed, daily, silent. Every aesthetic choice, every beautiful setting, every spontaneous experience carries a cost that doesn't show up in the caption, but does show up on the credit card, in anxiety, and in the decisions that follow. Glamour creates the illusion of lightness, but behind it, there's an invisible spreadsheet running all the time. New clothes aren't vanity, they're narrative maintenance. Restaurants aren't pleasure, they're image consistency. Travel isn't rest, it's content. And when everything becomes part of the display, life stops being lived and starts being sustained. That might sound extreme, but it isn't. Almost no one notices this because they've been trained to look only at the final result, never the behind the scenes. The problem begins when the image demands consistency. Once you position yourself at a certain level, you can't pull back without it looking like something went wrong. And that's when the game turns cruel. It doesn't matter how much comes in, it matters how much has to keep going out so that nothing appears to change to those watching. In this scenario, the influencer doesn't live off what they earn. They live off what they have to sustain in order not to fall. Income becomes just enough oxygen to keep their head above water. That completely changes how money is perceived. It stops being a tool for building and becomes an emotional shock absorber. It's used to numb the feeling of always being behind, always owing something to the audience, always on the verge of disappointing. The impact isn't just financial, it's psychological. The mind starts operating in a constant state of urgency, even when everything looks calm on the outside. And maybe the most unsettling part is realizing how this spills into small decisions, choices that, on their own, seem harmless, but together build a pattern that's hard to break. You stop deciding based on what makes sense for your journey and start deciding based on what keeps the image stable. The hidden cost here isn't just the money spent, but the freedom lost to say, this doesn't fit my life right now. This model of living quietly teaches that stepping back is failure, that simplifying means losing value, that silence equals absence. And once these beliefs settle in, the impact goes far beyond social media. They shape mindset, reshape priorities, and distort the idea of success. The economy of appearance doesn't charge everything at once. It charges slowly, in emotional installments that almost no one accounts for. If you realize you've made decisions more to sustain an image than to respect your own moment, write this in the comments. This makes sense to me. Because recognizing this doesn't end the conversation, it opens space to see something even deeper about comparison, value, and the way money influences choices that feel personal, but rarely are. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because up to this point it might seem like all of this only applies to people who live off their own image. But the system only works because there's someone on the other side, watching, comparing, and, without realizing it, measuring themselves against a standard that was never meant to be reached. That's where the focus completely shifts. The story stops being about the influencer and starts being about the person watching. Social comparison doesn't start as envy, it starts as curiosity. A quick glance, a passing thought, a subtle feeling that maybe you're moving a bit too slowly. And that feels harmless. It feels normal, but it isn't. Because comparison doesn't show you the whole path. It only shows you the loudest highlight of someone else's life. Even so, the brain reacts as if that were a real, complete reference. The cycle forms with almost no resistance. The more the influencer needs to look successful, the further the content drifts from reality. The more that image repeats, the more the viewer feels like they're falling behind. And once that feeling settles in, a quiet urgency appears. To keep up, not out of clear ambition, but to avoid feeling left out. Spending a little more, rushing a decision, maintaining a standard that doesn't quite fit yet, all start to feel reasonable inside this distorted logic. The tension grows because no one enters this game thinking they're competing. People believe they're just living, allowing themselves, enjoying life. but almost no one realizes they're emotionally reacting to stimuli that were designed to provoke exactly that response. Social comparison doesn't measure success. It measures anxiety. It measures how much you can tolerate the feeling of being out of sync with the pace someone else chose to display. The impact goes far beyond the money spent. It reaches mindset. The way you interpret your own decisions starts to shift. Real achievements lose weight because they aren't visible. Important processes feel slow because they don't generate instant validation. The journey becomes uncomfortable because the reference point is no longer internal, it's external. And when that happens, money turns into a tool for short-term relief, not long-term building. There's a hidden truth here that's rarely said out loud. Most people who feel behind aren't actually behind. They're just looking at the wrong references. References that survive by speeding up the perception of time, shortening processes, and turning exceptions into routines. The real backstage of this comparison is a constant exhaustion from trying to keep up with something that has no finish line. When you start to see this, something shifts. Not all at once, but gradually. A different kind of discomfort shows up, more conscious, more aware, a quiet question about how many choices were truly yours. And this kind of realization doesn't paralyze you. It invites a more honest transformation, one that's more aligned with your real life. If at any point you realized you've stepped into this game without noticing, write in the comments. I'm on this journey too, because recognizing it doesn't solve everything, but it changes the starting point. And from here, the conversation begins to touch something even more sensitive about identity, value, and the invisible cost of trying to belong to a pace that was never yours. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because there's a silence almost no one hears when they look at this kind of life. A silence that sits behind the camera, outside the frame, far from the polished edit. That's where the narrative starts to break down, not because the person is lying all the time, but because money doesn't always keep up with the story that needs to be told. What doesn't show up is the instability. Income that changes from one month to the next. Dependence on an algorithm no one controls. The constant feeling that a single drop in reach is enough to make everything start to shake. This isn't exaggeration, it's backstage reality. When image becomes the main asset, any fluctuation becomes a threat. And the higher the projected standard, the smaller the margin for error. There's a common belief that people who make a living online have freedom, but the hidden truth is that many times that freedom is only apparent. The fear of disappearing, of losing relevance, of not being able to sustain the pace creates an invisible pressure that follows every decision. You can't pause, you can't simplify, you can't disappear. The narrative has to keep going even when the money can't keep up. This is where money changes function. It stops being a tool for building and becomes an anesthetic. It's used to ease insecurity, to buy time, to keep the image breathing a little longer. It doesn't solve the problem, it just numbs the discomfort for a short while. And this cycle comes at a high cost, because life becomes about avoiding collapse, not building something solid. This dynamic doesn't just reshape finances, it reshapes mindset. Every decision starts being made based on external impact, not internal sustainability. The journey stops being about growth and becomes about maintenance. And maintaining is always more exhausting than building, because there's no sense of progress, only survival. The most delicate point is realizing this isn't an individual failure. It's not about pointing fingers or judging personal choices. It's a system that rewards constant appearance and punishes any sign of pause. A system that creates the illusion of stability while pushing people toward increasingly risky decisions, both emotionally and financially. When you start to notice this silence, something shifts. Comparison loses strength. The perfect narrative starts to feel too heavy to carry, and an uncomfortable but necessary question emerges. How far is it worth going to sustain an image that doesn't leave you room to fail, to breathe, or to be real? If this part of the conversation triggered something or brought a quiet sense of recognition, comment, "This makes sense to me." Because recognizing this silence doesn't end the journey, it opens space to see more clearly what's really at stake when money, image, and identity become so deeply intertwined. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because after noticing the silence behind the camera, one question remains, one that almost no one has the courage to ask. It isn't a comfortable question, And it isn't a popular one, but it completely shifts the axis of the conversation. If no one were watching, would you make the exact same financial choices you make today? This question doesn't accuse, judge, or demand an immediate answer. It simply reveals. It reveals how many decisions aren't born from genuine desire, but from the need to sustain an acceptable version of ourselves. It reveals how much of our financial journey is guided less by strategy and more by an audience. And almost no one notices this because we were taught to confuse recognition with progress. When the external gaze is removed from the equation, many things start to lose meaning. Certain expenses stop feeling urgent, some goals feel strangely empty, and choices that once seemed normal begin to feel forced. This is the hidden truth social comparison tries to conceal. A large part of the effort isn't about building something solid, it's about not appearing smaller than someone else in a very specific moment. The shift here is subtle but deep. The next step isn't making more money. It isn't accelerating income or chasing shortcuts. It's reducing the invisible wear of trying to prove something to people who don't pay your bills, aren't part of your backstage, and don't feel the impact of your decisions when the camera turns off. This mindset change doesn't happen overnight. It starts as a quiet discomfort that slowly reorganizes priorities. When you ask this question honestly, space opens up for transformation, not the performative kind, full of announcements and promises, but a quieter, internal, consistent one. A transformation that allows room to make mistakes, to adjust, to simplify. One that gives money back its role as a tool, not an identity. One that lifts the weight of comparison and places the focus back on your own path, your own pace. The impact doesn't show up immediately on your bank statement, but it shows up in decisions, in the ability to say no, in the calm of not joining certain races, in the clarity of understanding that success isn't about looking successful all the time, but about sustaining choices that still make sense when no one is applauding. This question doesn't close anything. On the contrary, it opens an entire field of reflection about financial identity, invisible consumption, and psychological freedom. And the longer you sit with it, the more you realize that many of the answers were being sought in the wrong place. If this question is still echoing inside you, write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." Because recognizing this point isn't the end of the conversation, it's the moment the journey starts to become more honest, lighter, and paradoxically stronger. If you made it this far, it's because this conversation didn't stay on the surface. At some point, it touched something real. Maybe choices you've already made, maybe doubts you'd never put into words. And when a reflection reaches that level, it stops being just content and becomes something closer to companionship on the journey. If it feels right to you, leave a comment below with something simple, just to mark that you were here. It can be, "This message was meant for me," or "I'm with you until the end." Not as an obligation, but as a quiet way of saying, "I heard this, I understood it, I'm thinking about it." Those comments often create an interesting space where different people realize they're not alone in questioning these things. If, during the video, you felt this conversation brought clarity, or at least an honest sense of discomfort, liking the video is an easy way to keep this kind of reflection alive here. It's not just about numbers. It helps the algorithm understand that there's still room for deeper conversations, without noise, without empty promises. And if you want to keep exploring themes like this, subscribing to the channel is simply a way of saying, "I want to keep thinking about money, mindset, and decisions, with more calm and less comparison. No rush, no ready-made formula, just going deeper into what actually matters." There's a video right here that connects directly with everything we've just talked about. It complements this line of thought and takes the reflection to another angle that often goes unnoticed. Click and continue with me there. The journey doesn't end here, it just shifts to another layer.